Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today we're diving into a clash that few people know about, but that quietly reshaped the path to World War II. Before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, before Hitler invaded Poland, something was already smoldering in the vast and remote borderlands of East Asia. So let me ask you this: what happens when two rising empires, both suspicious and power-hungry, play chess on someone else's territory with armies instead of pawns? The sparks don't always explode right away, but they light the fuse. Let's set the stage. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan was no longer a closed island nation. It was an imperial machine with a hunger for land and resources. By 1931, they had seized Manchuria, carving out a puppet state called Manchukuo. It was presented as independent, but make no mistake, Tokyo pulled every string. Now, on the other side of this growing tension was the Soviet Union. Stalin, fresh off his brutal Great Purge, was paranoid, ruthless, and determined to rebuild a military he had just gutted. His answer? A top-down overhaul. He restructured the Red Army, filled it with loyal but often untested officers, and pushed forward a new vision of Soviet might. Think of it as a military born out of fear and designed to survive it. Meanwhile, the region itself was becoming a board of proxy pieces. Mongolia had aligned itself with the Soviet Union and functioned as a satellite state. Japan held Manchukuo. The result? Two rival empires with their flags planted on neighboring territories, each suspicious, each armed, and each convinced the other was encroaching. And the borders? Well, that's where things get messy. In these remote steppes, mountains, and deserts, borders weren't clearly marked. Maps were vague, claims overlapped, and in an era of rising militarism, that ambiguity was like dry grass in the wind, just waiting for a spark to ignite it. So, we have rival empires, competing ideologies, puppet states at their service, and no one even agrees where the borders are. What could possibly go wrong? Let's find out. So, what actually happened when those smoldering tensions we just talked about finally boiled over? Let me take you to the edge of the Mongolian desert, near a river called Khalkhin Gol. It's 1939. It's hot, it's remote, and it's about to become the site of one of the most important and forgotten clashes before World War II. Now, officially, this was a border dispute, a minor misunderstanding between Mongolia, backed by the Soviets, and Manchukuo, backed by the Japanese. But here's the thing: when both sides start sending tanks and bombers to settle a local disagreement, you know it's a bit more than a cartography issue. At the heart of this conflict was Khalkhin Gol, a river in a region where even the locals couldn't agree which side belonged to whom. Soviet and Japanese troops collided there, not metaphorically, literally. And when the dust settled, this wasn't a skirmish, it was a full-scale military operation. Now, let's talk about the people in charge, because this wasn't just any battle, it was a clash of strategic minds. On the Soviet side, General Georgy Zhukov, not yet a household name, but he would be. Zhukov came in hot, fast, mechanized, and brutally efficient. His tactics were unorthodox, even for the Red Army. Think sweeping encirclements, rapid armored strikes, and ruthless momentum. On the Japanese side, General Komatsubara Michitaro led the charge. He followed more conventional doctrine: hold the line, reinforce your positions, and wear the enemy down. That would have worked if his opponent wasn't rewriting the playbook. But there's something else you need to understand: Japan wasn't unified in its strategy. The Imperial Army wanted to push north and confront the Soviets. The Navy wanted to focus south, on the Pacific and Southeast Asia. This split meant Japan's response to the Khalkhin Gol crisis was muddled, confused orders, divided attention, and half-committed resources. And that gave Zhukov an opening. For the Soviets, this was more than a battle. It was a test. Could their new doctrine, mechanized warfare with tanks, artillery, and aircraft working together, actually work in the field? This wasn't just about defeating the Japanese. It was about proving that a purged, restructured Red Army could still strike hard, fast, and smart. What started as a remote border dispute was quickly turning into a proving ground for modern warfare. The stakes? Way higher than anyone realized. But how did internal systems, incentives, and military politics shape the choices these commanders made? Let's unpack that next. Now, let's pull back the curtain, not on the battlefield, but behind it. Because if you want to understand how wars unfold, you can't just study the soldiers. You have to study the systems that tell them what to do. Let's start with the Soviets. Stalin's Great Purge had devastated the Red Army's command structure. Thousands of officers, some of the best and brightest, were executed or imprisoned. What remained was a new generation of leaders who had survived not because they were the most capable, but because they were the most loyal. But here's the twist: that very destruction forced innovation. In the chaos, younger officers like Zhukov rose rapidly. They couldn't rely on old hierarchies or traditions, those had been wiped out. Instead, they were forced to adapt, to think fast, to improvise. Post-purge desperation turned into a kind of creative pressure cooker. Now jump across the border to the Japanese side. The Japanese army in Manchukuo wasn't exactly waiting for orders from Tokyo. Local commanders often acted independently, sometimes recklessly, because communication was slow, and political agendas were messy. In fact, some of the most aggressive moves at Khalkhin Gol were launched without clear permission. This wasn't a disciplined war machine. It was a patchwork of ambition and autonomy. And that brings us to one of the most dangerous forces in wartime decision-making: incentives. For Soviet commanders, the greatest sin wasn't failure, it was hesitation. After the purges, doing nothing looked like sabotage. Taking bold action, even if it ended in disaster, was often safer than playing it cautious. Think about that for a second. When fear of political punishment shapes battlefield decisions, you get risk-taking without strategy. And in Japan, the problem was pride. Local commanders wanted glory, medals, prestige. That often meant launching unauthorized attacks or escalating tensions just to make a name for themselves. In both systems, the incentives were misaligned. Leaders were rewarded not for coordination or long-term planning, but for aggression, speed, and loyalty to ideology, not to logic. But despite all this dysfunction, the Soviets demonstrated something impressive. Their combined arms doctrine, integrating tanks, infantry, and air power into a single, unified strategy, actually worked. At Khalkhin Gol, they pulled it off, and it showed that even an unstable system, under pressure, can produce innovation. But at what cost? Let's look at what that cost, and that success, led to on the battlefield. Alright, so we've set the stage, introduced the players, and examined the systems that shaped their every move. Now it's time to talk about what actually happened when the dust settled at Khalkhin Gol. The result was a blowout, and not in Japan's favor. Over 20,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in the fighting. Let that number sit for a moment. 20,000 for a border skirmish that most people today haven't even heard of. It was a decisive Soviet victory, and more than that, it was a vindication of Zhukov's tactics and Stalin's rebuilt military doctrine. The Red Army had taken a risk with its combined arms approach, using synchronized waves of tanks, artillery, and air support. And it had worked spectacularly. But how did Japan respond to this crushing defeat? They denied it. Instead of acknowledging what had happened, Japanese leadership downplayed the loss. They shifted focus. They redirected their ambitions away from the Soviet Union and toward the Pacific. You can almost hear the internal memo: let's just not talk about Khalkhin Gol. Strategically, this was huge. By pulling away from the Soviet front, Japan began laying the groundwork for its southern advance, eventually targeting Southeast Asia and, of course, the United States at Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, the victory had the opposite effect. It supercharged Soviet confidence. After years of political purges and internal fear, Khalkhin Gol proved that the Red Army could still fight and win. Zhukov's star rose fast. This battle didn't just win him prestige, it earned him trust. And that trust would matter deeply in the years ahead, when Nazi Germany came knocking. And let's not forget one more outcome: border stability. The outcome at Khalkhin Gol led to a formalization of the Mongolia-Manchukuo border. It didn't eliminate tension, but it reduced open fighting, at least until 1945. For the moment, the Soviets had made their point. The border was drawn in blood, but it held. So what ripple effects did this forgotten war have on the rest of World War II? That's next. So how does a remote battle in a dusty corner of Asia echo into the largest war the world has ever known? More than you'd think. Let's start with Japan. After their defeat at Khalkhin Gol, Japanese leaders had a choice to make: keep pushing north into Siberia to challenge the Soviet Union, or pivot south toward the Pacific. The loss made that choice crystal clear. Japan turned south. Instead of risking another disastrous confrontation with the Red Army, Japan decided to go after softer, resource-rich targets. Places like Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, eventually, the Philippines, and yes, Pearl Harbor. In a strange way, Khalkhin Gol helped steer Japan directly into conflict with the United States. And for the Soviets, the impact was just as profound, but in the opposite direction. Zhukov's success gave Stalin the confidence to pull massive forces from the Far East and redeploy them westward, just in time for the Nazi invasion in 1941. Those battle-hardened divisions, trained under Zhukov's command structure, would become the steel wall that slowed Hitler outside Moscow. Think about that for a second. Without Khalkhin Gol, Stalin might not have trusted those troops. Without that trust, they might not have arrived in time. And without that defense, Moscow might have fallen. And here's the most underappreciated point: both empires learned something about themselves. The Japanese learned that their northern strategy was more costly than they'd thought. The Soviets learned that mechanized, coordinated warfare could break even a fanatically disciplined enemy. Zhukov himself? He walked away from the battle not just with experience, but with a blueprint, a tactical framework that he would later unleash against the Nazis again and again. So no, Khalkhin Gol wasn't just a border skirmish. It was a hinge point, a quiet but powerful redirection of global war strategy. And underneath it all was something deeper, a reflection of how the systems behind these two empires, how they made decisions, assigned blame, and rewarded risk, shaped the direction of global history. And that's what we'll explore next. Let's take a step back now, not just from the battlefield, but from the entire timeline, because behind every bullet fired, every tank rolled out, and every decision made at Khalkhin Gol was a system, a structure, a way of thinking. And both the Soviet Union and Imperial Japan had something in common. They were deeply centralized states. Power didn't flow from the bottom up. It was imposed from the top down, ruthlessly, sometimes blindly. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's iron grip meant that generals weren't just judged by results, but by loyalty. Fear became a management tool. Innovation was only tolerated if it succeeded. And yet, ironically, that same paranoia sometimes produced breakthroughs, like Zhukov, like combined arms warfare. But here's the catch: those successes didn't come from the system working. They came from people surviving the system. Over in Japan, the rigidity showed in a different way. Military factions operated like rival kingdoms inside the same government. The army and the navy didn't just disagree, they undermined each other. Strategies collided, resources were split, and decisions weren't made based on the best outcomes, but on maintaining control. And then there's the issue of incentives. When rewards are tied to loyalty instead of performance, you get yes men. When promotions come from demonstrating aggression rather than wisdom, you get reckless commanders. And when your entire hierarchy punishes caution more than failure, you get wars like Khalkhin Gol, where thousands die to prove a point no one fully understands. So what do we take from all this? Systems matter. They shape outcomes not just through grand plans, but through everyday decisions made by people trapped inside them. A well-designed system channels creativity, coordination, and accountability. A broken one distorts incentives, isolates leaders, and creates failure that looks like strategy until it explodes. Khalkhin Gol didn't happen just because two armies met on a disputed riverbank. It happened because two empires, each driven by centralized ambition and warped internal logic, collided under pressure, and the consequences rippled outward for years. Now let's finish with what history tried to forget, and what we must remember. So here we are, at the end of a story most people never knew began. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol, the so-called Nomonhan incident, wasn't just a strange prelude to World War II. It was a mirror, a warning, a crossroads where the future bent under the weight of ambition, fear, and design. We often remember the big headlines, the invasions, the declarations of war, the treaties inked in marble halls. But sometimes, it's the quiet wars that shape the loud ones. This forgotten clash in a desolate corner of Mongolia changed the course of nations. It redirected Japan's warpath, empowered Stalin's generals, and gave the world a preview of the kind of industrial, mechanized warfare that would define the global conflict to come. And what caused it? Not just geography, not just rivalry, but systems. Systems that rewarded the wrong actions, ignored nuance, punished hesitation, and demanded obedience above reason. It raises the question: how often has history been distorted by the very frameworks meant to guide it? How many wars have begun, not because people wanted them, but because the systems they lived in left no other path? At Truth Behind History, we tell stories like these not just to remember what happened, but to question how it happened, and why it matters now. Because history isn't just about the past. It's a flashlight for the present, and sometimes, a warning flare for the future. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and brings these forgotten stories back into the light. And if you want to listen to this episode on the go, check out the podcast version in the description below. We've got plenty more deep dives like this one, so stick around if you're the kind of person who likes history with teeth. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.